Good afternoon, and welcome back to the continuation of our Wednesdays at the Center series on John Hope Franklin and global anti-racism. Today's presentation is titled Extracting and Exacting Whiteness, Why Asians Call Euro-Americans Enemies of Heaven in the 19th Century with Dr. Mark Driscoll. Please remember to keep yourself muted, but you can keep your cameras on and share comments or questions in the chat for the Q&A. And now let us welcome Dr. Leo Ching, Professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University, who will serve as our moderator and introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Leo Ching. I teach at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University. My office is actually in the Franklin Center, a few doors away from the room where the Wednesday conversation takes place every week. I really miss the bustling and the excitement that the events generate, especially the food. So hopefully we will be able to return to the Franklin Center sooner than later. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Mark Driscoll, at this virtual Franklin Center event. I understand that time is limited, so I'll try to be brief. So there will be ample time for Mark's presentation and Q&A with you afterwards. Let me begin with an anecdote. I'll preface by saying that I can't remember whether this is something relayed to me by Mark himself or something that I actually experienced, but nonetheless, it's all the same. So, the late Professor Miriam Silverberg, who taught history, Japanese history at UCLA, was once asked about her impression of a paper she was given to read. Her curt response was simply, "No imagination." Those of you who know Professor Silverberg's work will immediately understand her insistence on creativity and resourcefulness in academic work, especially in a field such as history, which has had long-standing struggle between empiricism and lyricism. No imagination is something I always take to heart doing my own work, but also as a cautionary tale I tell my students. I bring this up just to say that, at least in the field of Japanese empire studies, and according to Mark, there's only 4 of us, there are a few whose work is more creative, ingenious, and inspiring than Mark Driscoll. Just look at the title of his books: Absolute Erotic, Absolute Grotesque, The Living, Dead, and Undead in Japan's Imperialism, 2010, Duke University Press. The Whites Are Enemies of Heaven, Climate, Caucasianism, and Asian Ecological Protection, 2020, also from Duke University Press. In fact, it just came out, so please go buy it. Thanks, Mark, for the copy. Provocative, playful, and yet serious. Few of us, I would guess, could come up with exciting and eye-catching titles like these. In Absolute Erotic, Absolute Grotesque, Mark develops a biopolitical, neuropolitical, necropolitical scheme to brilliantly, or I should say horrifically, explain the changing characteristics of Japanese imperialism and capitalism from the early colonization of Taiwan and Korea to later rule in Manchuria. Mark's main characters in the book are Chinese coolies, Japanese pimps, and human traffickers, Japanese sex workers, and Korean peasants. His wide-ranging subjects are the extraction of human labor, sexology and pornography, mass culture and fascism in Japan, Japanese opium regimes in Manchuria, for examples. I will simply add that Mark is one of the few people I know who effortlessly and eloquently navigates between quote-unquote high theory, archived in both Japanese and Chinese languages, and everyday politics. More importantly, Mark's work is not just historical, a deep engagement with the Japanese empire in a global context, but his thinking and concepts are always in conversation with today's problems, such as racism, extraction, ecologies, and so on and so forth. Lastly, I will add that Mark has been an outspoken supporter of student and youth activism. He wrote an op-ed to call out the silence of white liberal administrators and faculty at UNC for not vocally support the young multiracial activist who led the anti-Silent Sam movement at UNC Chapel Hill. He also wrote to protest the Board of Governors firing of former UNC system president Tom Ross, demanding accountability and insisting on the democratic process with input and participation from faculty administrators in the 16 campuses of the University of California system, University of North Carolina system. I guess I'm missing my alma mater here. Mark is a provocateur, a troublemaker, but also a deep thinker and an ally. One may disagree with his seemingly irreverent style of writing, but no one can doubt his theoretical brilliance and political commitment. Since Julie already introduced the title of his talk, I'll just simply say, please join me and welcome Professor Mark Driscoll.
Great, Leo, thank you so much for the kind and gracious introduction. This is great. It's a great opportunity for me to present this, and want to thank APSI and International Studies at Duke. I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Also acknowledge that both in Durham and Chapel Hill Scarborough are on stolen land for the Catawba and Occaneechi First Nations. And me at UNC, the university was built by slaves and for some free Blacks, and continues to be supported and maintained by prison laborers. So anyway, I'm gonna present a lot of material here, but actually put more material up on my PowerPoint than I can actually verbalize. So things are gonna go very fast, but I'll try to talk very slowly and walk you through some of the main themes that are in my recent book. Okay, I'm gonna do the screen share now. Okay, let me move this over just a little bit. Okay, the first thing I want to present, just a larger context for this. These are very rough figures, but it's important that we have some idea of what's happening. The global gross domestic product in 1775, when Watt marketed the coal-powered steam engine, his second version of that. China had 30% of global economic output. Korea, Japan, Okinawa, and Vietnam, together with them, had 40%. India had 15% of global economic output. Now we go to Europe, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and Portugal, plus their colonies, excepting India, had 30% of global economic output. As most of you know, this was because of large European trade deficits and large surpluses from the Sino-centric trading area. Okay. Now, in 1775, just a little bit of background, Charleston, South Carolina becomes the biggest slave trading port, Britain's largest slave trading port in the world. And it's also the second year of the East India Company's opium monopoly, which was pioneered by Warren Hastings. The opium monopoly did lots of things, but the most important, it systematized opium cultivation, production, and packaging at huge what I call drug labs or distribution centers. Think about the equivalent today with Amazon. At these 4 distribution centers, the drugs were then moved to Calcutta, where the East India Company held opium auctions and sold the drugs to private drug lords, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's father, Warren Delano. And these private drug lords, 95% of them were white men, brought the drugs to Guangzhou, China, to sell to really the wealthiest consumers in the world at the time. People were targeted by the East India Company and by these white drug dealers to make as much money as possible off of these consumers. Okay. Here's a, oh my God. Here's a, you can see the massive facility here for purifying opium. This is a famous picture of the opium balls that are stacked up. Now, part of what I do in the book that I won't have time to talk about today is there was a shift from renewable energy to fossil fuels, or what Mom calls fossil capitalism. Now, most of us were taught in college that this happened because the lower unit costs of coal made this a rational choice for capitalists. This is completely false. Coal was more expensive than renewable energy in the 1790s, the 1800s. It's the same thing in the US. And really, we're only talking about the UK and the US when we're talking about fossil capitalism. So at the origins of today's climate breakdown, capitalists shift from renewable to carbon emitting energy. Mom says this, and he's right, to cheapen labor and to control natural environments. And I talk a little bit about this in the book. I'm happy to answer questions about this later. This is a controversial statement. Now, this is one of the causes for what I call climate caucasianism that emerged with massive deforestation and monocropping in South Asia, the Caribbean, the US, and lots of other places. Later, this intensified with coal extraction in the UK, US, and in Japan and China. This is my definition of climate Caucasianism: a relational position of extra active superiority to Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, non-human nature that justified unlimited extraction. So that's what I talked about. Extra action is the ground for unlimited extraction. There's lots of people talking about this, about extractivism in the epistemology of extraction, but just generally for our purposes, it begins in this so-called scientific revolution with Bacon is crucial in Descartes, but also the policy intellectuals were Locke and Kant. Both of them proponents of slavery and the view that nature was to be subordinated to rational Europeans. Okay, what did Japanese and Chinese elites think about Eurodescendants or the proponents of climate Caucasianism during the imposition of Treaty Port Imperialism in East Asia from 1839 to 1890? This is what they thought of them. You see, this is from Lovecraft Country here. So if you see the hideous zombie killer on the left, that's really an accurate representation of what people thought about Euro-Americans coming to East Asia. This is maybe an even scarier incarnation of those killer zombies. I'm not sure. Okay. Now, the phrase that I'm using, one other phrase, and this will be the last of the litany of names. I call this formation superpredation. Again, if we go back, this is super predatory, this monster here, but the whole regime is super predatory. And obviously, I'm trying to push back against the language of super predators in denigrating African-American teenagers used by Biden and the Clintons in 1993 and 1994. But the difference between super predators or apex predators with a small s and a big S, like these climate Caucasianists or Euro-American imperialists, is unlike in the animal kingdom. They don't have the power to establish the programs that naturalize the hierarchy that white super predators assume: solipsistic individualism, vicious market competition, etc. That's the difference between super predators with a small s and super predators with a capital S. Okay. Okay, more concretely, racial fossil capitalism was achieved, this is what I argue in the beginning of the book, through what I call a 4C circuit. The first C was a clipper ship. The clipper ships were the fastest vessels in the world in 1780s, 1790s, 1800s. And their design emerged from slave ships, the 1780s. Now they were equipped, they were super high tech, although they did not run on coal. So they just were wind-powered vessels. But in terms of the military hardware, there was lots of machines that were designed to kill and intimidate people. The most important, I think, was this mobile carronade. It was a small cannon that was very powerful, but also light, and therefore didn't weigh down the ship. Also, the carronade, as you can see, it could be turned on the crew or could be turned on slaves during uprising. But really, it was used against pirates who were trying to take this very valuable resource, opium. The second C in that 4C circuit was, please, in quotation marks, coolie. This is the Hindi and the Chinese for coolie here. These coolie captives were trafficked to British colonies in Asia and Africa, and then across the Pacific to replace Afro-descendant slaves in the US and in the Caribbean. 1 million Chinese captives went to the Americas from 1839 to 1890. The third C is contraband drugs and weapons. Now, one of the things I'm doing in the book, to in some sense, to show how crucial this was, is to try to establish a historical cognate between opium anarchy on the South China coast and the crack cocaine epidemic in the US in the 1980s and 90s. What I mean by that is there's all kinds of homologies. For example, opium was swallowed and snorted in South and East Asia in the 17th and 18th, 19th century. The same thing with cocaine in the 60s and 70s. And then both of the drugs were smoked. Opium beginning in 1780, 1790. And then, of course, crack cocaine is a smoked version of that. But the other homologous element I want to bring up is that when these drugs, these contraband drugs and weapons move into an area in Southeast China or in urban areas in the US, money and people come out in the opposite direction. So Black kids and adults are locked up in cages in mass incarceration. And in the case of China, you have at least 1 million coolies sent across the Pacific, but many more Chinese are forced to do sex and service work for white men mainly, but also for other Chinese and South Asian men in the new treaty port areas like Shanghai, Guangzhou, in Hong Kong and Singapore. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this one. You all can see that the drug dealers and the Anglo colonizers had very cynical language for talking about the linkages between some of the aspects of this 4C circuit. But one of the most disgusting was this poison in pigs. So poison, of course, is the opium. Pigs are the Chinese men that build the railroads, connect the East Coast to the West Coast of the US. And they were called pigs for this hair cue that was said to resemble a pig's tail. But really the most important people in this 4C circuit are these white drug lords. Donald Trump called Latino successors of these men, bad hombres and sick people. This is, again, Warren Delano, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. But they really were sick white guy narco-terrorists. They pioneered all these tactics that would later be adopted by Latin American narcotraficantes, including this bribe or a bullet, but also the what I call an entrepreneurial innovation of hanging the murdered bodies of those unwilling to cooperate with them up on their mast to intimidate other people. Now, it's important for me to put on the table, England started a major international conflict with Qing China, again, the leading economic power in the world at this time, to protect these white guy drug dealers. This is the first Opium War, or what I call the first war for drugs. The last aspect in that 4C circuit is, of course, capital. So much money is made, first in the slave trade, then in the drug trade, also in the coolie trade. This gets circulated into financial circles, and it's very important. It, in some sense, subsidizes the shift to coal as an energy source. Now, hopefully I've laid it out that there should be absolutely no surprise that Japanese and Chinese resisted this formation, resisted white superpredation. So I just point out that I would say most of the scholarship would disagree with this. Most of the scholarship would disagree with this statement. But anyway, so they resisted this because they resisted this similar to the way that blacks fighting back against killer zombie whiteness in Haiti, Virginia, New Orleans. Okay, similar to that, Japanese and Chinese drew on a wide variety of resistance strategies to counteract this new formation, white superpredation. In Japan, that rallying cry was Son no Joi. And there are the Chinese characters read from left to right. Now, there are different meanings in East Asia about the different versions of these characters. But in Japan in the 1840s and 1850s, it emerged in opposition to the warlords that had ruled Japan in the 17th and 18th century, in addition to identifying the white super predators that had invaded their country. So I translate this as revere the emperor, fight the whites, fight the white people. They were the ones targeted by arguably most of the deployment of this phrase. Now, I should just pause and ask rhetorically, what did the US want from Japan? Really, what they wanted is somewhat more than what the UK took by force in the First War for Drugs. They wanted colonial treaty port concessions, control or have a strong voice in Japan's trade policy, in the extra active freedom to steal and purchase coal, gold, and silk. The US also wanted treaty ports, concessions to support its global extraction operations of coal, whales, guano was an important fertilizer at the time, and other things. This is the image on the book here. Some of you know this. The most important actors in this resistance to white super predators were these people, with these rogue samurai, these Ronin. They left their domains in Japan to conduct guerrilla war against the Euro-white invaders, and they targeted white men. They assassinated white men, like this person, this translator and white supremacist, Henry Heusgen. I've already gotten into some trouble for this, and I anticipate getting into more trouble. We're supposed to imagine these men like Heusgen as these multicultural people who respected non-European people. That's not really how most Japanese saw them. Heusgen practiced white racial terrorism of what British diplomats call furious riding. This is what he was infamous for. White men in the treaty ports in Japan, they drink a lot of alcohol, and then this is called wilding. Some people call this wilding, but it was called furious riding. They would target pedestrians and try to hit them with their horses. And at least 2 Japanese, this is in the diplomatic record, we know there were at least 2 Japanese died from this practice. But in the treaty ports in Japan and China, in general, white men routinely assaulted and shot Chinese, often for just refusing to look away from them. And I argue in the book that this is very similar to different modes of white supremacist terror in the US South and other places. Reckless eyeballing, that if you looked at a white man or a white woman too long on the streets of Orange County, for instance, in the 1780s and 1790s, you could and you did pay with your life for this. In China and Japan, white men were put put local Asians at their disposal, forcing them to attend to all their needs and desires. Rape as a crime was almost inconceivable, very rarely punished. So like the sundown towns in Lovecraft Country, for instance, for those of you that have seen that, Shanghai's international settlement was off limits to Chinese after dark. They were afraid to go there. They'd get attacked, they'd get assaulted, they'd get raped by white Euro-Americans. Okay, this is another word to talk about valorous defenders. In Japanese, it's pronounced shi, shi, and Chinese is zhi, shi. And they're actually, the Japanese version is more important because they're developed these larger group of almost all men who joined together with these philosophers from a domain called Mito, which is south of Tokyo today, to establish what I call a decolonial critique. Now, I don't have too much time to go into this, but they understood the threat from the white West to be political, mythological, and ecological. The ecological criticism is what I'm most interested in. These people, these what I call them principal protectors, thought that Euro-Americans were living beyond what we call today their footprints, and they needed to invade Asian countries to steal their resources, to steal their valuables. This is what the principal protectors said in Japan. And I've done some work translating some of the stuff. I don't have too much time to go into this, but this is an explanation of what they thought about the relationship between human beings and other living and non-living forms of the world, largely Neo-Confucianism. And it's mapped onto animistic spiritualities in Japan and in China. So some of you know a lot about this as well, but this is part of what I call this philosophy of principal protection. I came up with climate Caucasianism from my reading of these writers, these principal protector authors. I think I'm going to skip this, but this notion of whites as enemies of heaven came from the writings of these principal protectors. Okay, here's one that I worked on. Kiyakawa is his name, who actually was the mastermind for the assassination of Heusken. What Kiyakawa said, Kiyakawa Hachiro, said that white people understand themselves to be individual subjects. And this is from Slavoj Žižek, of course, we changed the S into the dollar sign. Euro-whites' lack of benevolence and loyalty followed from their alienated solipsism. But what's interesting is that the principal protectors in Japan and in China also included Japanese and Chinese upper class people in this critique. So it wasn't completely xenophobic or even nationalistic. This is a global critique against people that they perceived as living beyond their means. Another way we could call this is maxing out their carbon budgets. Okay, now the principal protectors, both in Japan and China, but here I'm talking about Japan, preferred to be outside in biodiverse environments. And they were animists. They thought that the divine was in all things. Again, I'm going to skip over this. I apologize for running roughshod through some of this stuff. But Kiyakawa and the other principal protectors, they were animists. And what they did is they tried to intensify, different from extra action, again, which is the ground for extraction. What they tried to do in their religious practice or the spiritual practice was to deepen intra-action, which is, I'm theorizing that as an immanent relation to all living things, but especially to heavenly deities. This is a poem I translated. You all can look at this from a Kiyakawa poem and from 1862. This is some more stuff from Kirkal. I'm going to skip over this. I apologize. But this is some of the. Now, I'm going to shift real quickly to China now. And it might seem crazy, but Leo did a gracious introduction of some of my work. And I've been extremely critical of Japan's position in Asia. So my first book was actually in Japan and Korea. My 2010 book was on Japan and China. I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to look at Japan, look at the two great East Asian powers in the same analytic sphere. And it was very easy to do that through the lens of white superpredation or white racial capitalism. So the critique in China is originally deployed against the Catholic Church. They were the first settlers in China. And they were deliberately provocative in some of the ways they established their missions. You can see this church in Hebei province from the 1890s. It's just massive, way out of scale. But the principal protectors in China thought that the French Catholics did this to deliberately provoke the locals. And obviously it has other kinds of effects about installing superpredation on the landscape. British diplomats thought that French Catholics were trying to provoke this. And the locals, the Chinese locals, this is mainly in central and western China, but I've done almost all of my work on Sichuan province, which is, some of you have had the food. There's some great Sichuanese restaurants in the area, but almost all of my work in China has been focused on Sichuan, which is where the Catholic Church presence was as well. The locals thought that the Catholics built these churches like forts, really. So it was a militarization of the landscape. Here's a map here. If you can see China in the middle, Chengdu is the city that's next to Wuhan. Of course, we all know something about Wuhan. Chengdu is a political capital of Sichuan province. And this is where I've done some of my work. It's also one of the central sites for opium, for Chinese domestic opium production. And this is going to be crucial. The shift from British opium sold in China to Chinese import substitution, local cultivation, and local distribution, mainly by very poor subaltern men in China. That's going to invert that trade relationship one more. This is the second half of my new book where I talk about this. Okay, now after the Second War for Drugs, there were two opium wars. After the Second War for Drugs, most of the constraints on Euro-American missionaries, Catholic and Protestant, were removed, including the prohibition against drugs. So in 1858, drugs were no longer, they were decriminalized. So anybody now could technically, although different provinces had different regulations, could grow and use drugs. By 1890, there were 5,000 white Protestant missionaries in China and about 350 Catholic priests, but Chinese priests as well, Chinese Catholic priests. Okay. Sichuan and Shandong had the highest number of Catholic missions. I'm going to go through this again very quickly, but these were the two sites that had the most incidents of anti-Western resistance. Shandong is, of course, where the Boxers began, but in Sichuan, as I'm going to show, Sichuan was really the matrix for the decolonial resistance in the 1900s during the Xinhai Geming, the 1911 revolution, against both the Qing government and the Euro-Americans. Okay, some of the reasons for this are, again, should be very obvious with some of the things I've introduced, but there were other reasons as well. Chinese convert women, there were 20,000 there were 25,000 Catholic converts in Sichuan. But Chinese convert women had to be virgins to be married as Catholics. So Catholic priests, most of them Europeans, decided that they had the authority to check whether a woman was a virgin or not before their wedding. So there were all kinds of abuses that were perpetrated against Chinese women and men, the Chinese women in this context. This is one of the reasons for the Boxer uprising of 1899 and 1900. I'll just lay this out, don't have time to talk about this, but this German Catholic missionary priest, Stenz, was a serial rapist. There's very little doubt about this, which is consistent with Catholic priests' activity in the rest of the world at this time. This also was the case in Sichuan province. Now, the resistance to both the Catholic and the Protestant missions was led by this brotherhood society. They were outlaw brother society called Gula Wei. We know lots about them from, if you've seen maybe half of the Hong Kong films I've seen, has had brotherhood actors in it. For the most part, the Gula Wei were very poor men who were thrown out of village society for all kinds of reasons. A male-female ratio. Also, some of these men were homoerotic men, but a lot of these men were opium smokers, and opium smoking was still condemned in village societies in the 1850s and the 1860s. So some of these men fled into here's a picture of some Gula Wei people in 1910. The Gula Wei was the only group that encouraged opium smoking. You had to be a regular smoker to be a member. It was required. And the Gula Wei, this group again in central and western China, but again, I'm mainly focused on Sichuan, a little bit on Yunnan, which is the province right to the south of Sichuan. This group exploded in membership in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. And it correlates exactly to the spike in opium production and consumption by Chinese peasant farmers, okay? So remember, there's almost no British Anglo-Indian opium in Western China. Most of the opium is grown and smoked by local peasants, poor farmers. So that's what I try to show, and I actually do some empirical work where I try to show that on average, every male over 18 smoked 3 to 6 pipes of opium a day in Sichuan and in Yunnan. And about every other woman smoked as well. So women were widespread smokers. This is in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So there's this massive increase in opium cultivation and in opium smoking, and positive economic effects to this economic boom. I can talk more about that later. Some people consider this very controversial. Now, what happened with this opium boom in Western China and Central China is that the Protestant missionaries, really from after the Second War for Drugs, they decided they were going to crack down on opium smoking. So the American and Canadian Protestant missions in China led this war on drugs, on opium smoking, very widespread. They refused to accept converts that were regular opium smokers, and they set up what are called these opium refuges that are detox clinics. So the Protestant missions would have these small little hospitals where they would try to wean opium smokers off of opium. But these same Western missionaries, they did this by replacing opium smoking with modern pharmaceuticals that often they themselves made. So they would inject these people with with pharmaceuticals, or they would sell it to them in tablets. And for some of you might know this, that injecting or swallowing any drug is actually, you get a lot more of the content of the drugs than smoking. So this replacement of opium smoking by modern Western pharmaceuticals led by the Protestant missionaries, led to a huge spike in addiction in China. But what it also did is the opium smokers, so the peasants preferred smoking. It was social. You got together with your friends and got high. You yourself grew these drugs. You sold drugs to people in your neighborhood, in your village. So the peasants in Western China resisted. This is another reason for them to oppose the Western missions. When the Qing government itself decided to get on board with this anti-opium campaign in 1903, but really in September 1906, the Qing government initiated an opium suppression campaign. This is when the twin enemies of the Qing government and the Euro-American missionary presence in China emerged. So the battle during the Republican Revolution of 1911 was both directed on the people thought that the Qing government was too close to the Euro-American Protestants, both of them trying to oppose opium smoking, both of them trying to promote the injecting of Western and Japanese pharmaceuticals. This put them in, so this campaign put them in direct conflict with the opium cultivators and smokers in Sichuan province. And this is what caused the 1911 revolution. I'm suggesting it wasn't a correlation. There's a direct cause of this. Dynastic rule in China was caused by the decolonial movement to decriminalize opium and reject the big pharma of the West. So the Gulawei Brotherhood in Sichuan and Yunnan, their revolutionary movement that was joined by a lot of different kinds of people, modern revolutionaries, they wanted to kill two birds with one stoned group of uprising. And they were successful in overthrowing 2 or 3 millennia of Chinese dynastic rule. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. Sorry for being for going on too long, and I'll take your questions or comments or anything you want.
Incredible work, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing. I would love to hear a little bit more about your Decolonial. I think it's a very provocative, very historically accurate, and can have implications for global South studies, issues of other epistemic possibilities, the ontological turn, etc. I mean, very fascinating work. Thank you so much.
Miguel, thank you very much for the comment. I appreciate that. I won't say anything if that's okay, and leave more time for questions or comments.
Yes. Samuel Branch here. Quick question. I heard in your lecture that you made several references to getting in trouble. What type of opposition have you met when presenting this information in your lectures and discussions, if any, from any maybe major governmental powers or anything locally? How has that affected you, and how were you able to deal with that?
Samuel, thank you for the question. Very little, actually. This is white guy privilege. I have freedoms to say things I think that other people don't. There's been a little pushback in China, Samuel. The point that I have on China, that I think a group of opium smokers were the main actors in overthrowing dynastic rule. That's been controversial for some people, but the book just came out, so I haven't had much pushback on that yet. Samuel, I think most of, anyway, I could say a lot more on that, but thank you for the question, and actually very little pushback that I know of. I'm going up for full professor right now, and we'll see what my provost and dean think about this work, Samuel.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm unmuted, so I can moderate the conversation. Mark, you can just concentrate on what you want to. And so feel free to either put in the chat or I guess raise your hand, but it's kind of hard for me to see the hands.
I
So
have a
maybe-
question.
Yeah, please, Catherine.
I wanted to go back to, hi, Mark. I wanted to go back to early point. And I was wondering if you could explain again the difference between the super predators with a small s versus a big S.
Catherine, thank you so much for listening. This is awesome. Kathy, this is a great question. Yeah. Catherine, what I'm trying to do in the book is to try to make the sense that obviously the whole thing is a rejection of this racist anti-Black discourse that emanated really from the Democratic Party. Some of that Jim Crow Joe Biden is now the president of the United States. So what I try to do is obviously try to push back against that and expose that, and to suggest that white superpredation, there's no such thing as Black teenage super predators. That's just a fiction to justify the warehousing of Black and brown kids, adolescents and teenagers, and adults as well. But I capitalize it because white super predators actually have the power to justify everything. They control what Marx calls the truths of a society. They can control what we all have to think is rational and truthful. So for instance, free trade, the survival of the fittest, all these things are created by super predators with a capital S to justify their actual power hierarchies, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to say that white superpredation has this incredible power, not just physical power, like I tried to use the image from Lovecraft Country, not just this overwhelming military, demonically physical power, but an ideological and discursive power to completely control what's sayable and what isn't sayable. So that's how I try to distinguish the capital S super predator from small s super predator, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Mark,
yes, thank you.
Sorry about Mark, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One, I guess, is kind of related to Catherine's question. So are there any, this is from Elise Crystal, are there any lessons we can learn from your research and work that would be useful for us today?
Elise Crystal, thank you for the question. Yeah, I hope so. This is, some of you have gotten a sense of this, but this is all history of the present stuff. I'm not an empiricist historian like Leo said in the beginning. I don't think that there's no theory of physics that supports empiricism. It's an ideological justification for extra action, is what I would say, for white extra action. Like historians or scholars are somehow disconnected from their research topics. It's a complete fiction. And again, all theories from quantum mechanics to string theory shows how absurd and just ideological that a notion of positivism is. So at least my work is trying to I'm trying to be ethical to the 19th century materials that are driving this, but also I have one, actually, what I say is that people need to write with three eyes now. I mean, Hayden White was one of my teachers and Catherine's as well, but he used to say that you have two eyes. You have an eye on the present, you have an eye on the past. But now I think really, Native Americans talk about a third eye in the sense that you have to have an eye on the future, an eye on the present, and an eye on the past. Those three things have to be held in some kind of tension. And that's kind of what mobilizes my work. Those three, the way I think about what I'm doing.
Great. So I apologize if I mispronounce your name. So Salochana Naidu asked Mark, could you please talk more about coal not being cheaper than sustainable energy and about how it cheapened labor? I guess this is based on that book that you mentioned, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. This is very complicated, but we're taught to assume that the shift to fossil fuels happened because capitalists made a rational choice just to use an energy source that was cheaper per unit cost. So it was a rational choice that white fossil capitalists used to shift from, and again, this is the story of the climate catastrophe that we're living in. That's completely false. In the UK, Mom shows that the shift happened. Coal was actually more expensive. The shift happened because capitalists wanted to control labor. It was easier to bring machines to places that had cheaper, that labor was cheaper. My new work, actually, the new work I'm doing right now, says that the US and the UK, those are the two places where fossil capitalism takes off. There's basically no other place. What happened in the US is that coal wasn't cheaper either in the US compared to water and wind. Coal emerged in the 1790s, 1800s, because Black slaves were forced to dig it out of the ground. So again, it was more expensive. It only became economical because slave labor was forced to dig it out. This is a very controversial statement as well. But the beginnings of racial fossil capitalism in the UK and the US have to do with white supremacy. They have to do with extra action, both in its racial and in its ecological configurations. I could say more about that, but if that's okay for the person who asked the question.
Anybody else? So Mark, maybe let me throw, Alex has one. So have you considered bringing the American tobacco tycoons into your analysis of extraction and extraction? Could this be considered a war for drugs in East Asia and around the world? If so, how do you feel about the statue in front of the Duke Chapel? Excellent. Great question, Alex.
Alex, that is a great question. Alex, I will wait till I get my check, my honorarium, to answer the question about Duke. That is a great question. In China, I was lucky enough to present this 2 times, and people ask me about the tobacco stuff. I really haven't thought about that at all. It's a great connection, but you probably know this, and I'm sure a lot of people do. The connection between tobacco in North Carolina and China is absolutely crucial. So China was targeted both by British colonizers in South Asia and by marketers in the US South, in Virginia and North Carolina. So China was later, of course, that happened with tobacco. But no, that's a great question. And I'm sure you have more to say about it than I do. So I will shut up and let somebody talk about it who's thought about it more thoroughly.
Anybody else? So Mark, let me throw a quick East Asian studies question. So I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about the transition from barbarians to white men. Because as you know, right, the kind of Sinocentric differentiation is based on this Hua, the Chinese, and Yi, which meant barbarian, right? It was not about color of skin or anything. It's just a sort of concentric circle as it expands away from civility, right? So in what process, how did the Chinese or the Japanese internalize the discourse of whiteness that at the same time differentiate itself from barbarians, right? Because now whiteness represent the opposite of barbarians, right? So wondering if you can just say something about that.
Leo, that's a great question. There's a lot of great work that's been done on this. So Leo's referencing some fantastic work by Philippe Bazou, Lydia Liu's work. Leo, you have more things to say about this than I do. The way that I'm approaching this is to hold off on this is Chinese ideograph of E, the same pronunciation in Japanese, which has been translated as barbarian. And actually, I take the Philippe Bazou line and the Lydia Liu line, not to read it as barbarian, but just to read it, Leo, as foreigner or illiterate, or someone who's uncultured. and the way that Leo, and I try to stick to the text and the principle, the Shishi text that I'm reading, and to try to say, well, how are they deploying this Chinese character, barbarian or illiterate or foreigner? And they're Leo, they're conflating Japanese with that same character. So people who are living beyond their means, they consume too much, they pollute, they don't have respect for the gods and goddesses. They are also predators or super predators, or my translation is ignorant predators. Mm-hmm. So in China, there's a similar shift as well. So this denigration of outsiders, as it's easy in the case, you have these Euro-American drug dealers coming in, and what's happening in China, it's a lot easier to see how this could become very popular. This shift from an elite discourse all the way down to a local level, where a lot of people use this phrase to justify the denigration of Euro-Americans as enemies of heaven, Leo. So that's also one of the translations I use, that they're just opposed to everything that everyone who's literate is supposed to think is moral and just.
Right, great, thank you. I see that our time is probably up since Julie just showed up. So thank you, everyone. I guess Julie, is okay to close then?
Yeah, right, so thank you all for being here. Thank you to Dr. Ching. Thank you to Dr. Driscoll for sharing your insights. And we are so thankful to DUCIGS, the John Hope Franklin Center, and APSI for sponsoring today's talk. Make sure you join us next week for a lecture on covert racism in economics as part of our Wednesday at the Center John Hope Franklin Center Global Anti-Racism Series continues. Thank you all for being here.